do it. That's the next step.
Come together again for our fourth and final session in our Truth About Kabbalah series. We've discussed some aspects of theoretical Kabbalah, we've discussed some aspects of practical Kabbalah, and tonight we have the meditative Kabbalah to delve into. Did you bring your mats?
Yes.
Okay.
My legs are a little bit stiff, so I can't get into a lotus position. I can get into a half lotus position.
Usually when we think of Judaism, we don't associate Judaism with meditation. I think most of us probably associate Judaism with matzo balls and gefilte fish, and we don't really have any association with anything close to a meditative state. Sometimes we have too much matzah and Pesach, and it sort of brings you into a meditative state.
Unconsciousness.
Very cute.
The truth is, many are not aware of the depth of richness that we find within classic Torah Judaism, in the spiritual realm, in the realm of transcending different states of mind, different dimensions of reality. And many times people, instead of having the perspective that Torah philosophy is about reality and depth and elevation, somehow that becomes ritual and ceremony and symbolism. And that's what Judaism has really become to a large degree through the centuries. And the question is, why is that the case? If the real kernel of Torah Judaism, the real philosophy that we accepted at Mount Sinai more than 3,000 years ago, is something very far from ritual, very far from dry actions, why is that the way most people view Judaism? You could ask a similar question, which is, why in the last 250 years has there been a tremendous amount of Jews assimilated? What is the source of that? Now, clearly, you get involved with sociology, and there are many factors, many reasons, I'm sure. The Enlightenment and the ability to come to America, having a situation where the doors were open to us for the first time, not having to live in a ghetto. But the question is still very strong. If Judaism was given over in the way, in its authentic form, in the form that would excite and bring to life what our existence is all about, how is it possible that so many millions of Jews in just a couple hundred years would assimilate? And the answer is, the main part of the answer, is Judaism was not given over in its truest form. And this has been a problem for centuries. In the 1100s, the Rabbi one of the great commentators, the great Rishonim, he writes an introduction to his magnum opus, the Chovos Levavos, the Obligations of the Heart. He says that I look around in my generation, and there are many great people, many tremendous Torah scholars. But when it comes to certain aspects of the inner Torah, the part of Torah that's not necessarily what I'm doing, what I'm involved with in the realm of action, but the Torah which is inside me, the Rebbeinu B'chaya writes, I see there's a lot lacking. And he explores the issue in great depth, and he comes to the conclusion, we got to change things, and therefore I'm going to write a book. And that's what he does. And that particular book was very influential throughout all of the centuries. However, you fast forward 600 years, and you find yourself into the 18th century, and a man by the name of Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto comes along, and he has the same realization. In his introduction to one of his great works, the Mesilas Yesharim, The Path to the Just, he makes the observation that there's so many great people, so many Torah scholars, so many people that are involved with learning day and night, but I sense there's something lacking. we're not quite getting it right yet. And therefore I'm going to write my book. And he does so, and very influential, very powerful. It's a book that's learned now across the entire Jewish world in every yeshiva you go to. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter comes along in the 19th century, and he has the same realization that we're still not where we should be. There's always Torah learning, and there's always the performance of the mitzvos, but the one thing that seems to have been lacking for centuries upon centuries is the inner Torah. Now, what is that inner Torah? What is that thing that hasn't quite been right for a long time, and that the great lights of the generations past tried to come along and rectify? The inner Torah is referring to a certain level of joy that they felt was missing. It's referring to a focus on one's character traits, a focus on interpersonal relationships, a focus on spirituality. Some of these things... What's that?
Then that's what our next lecture series should be. What you're talking about, the joy.
Here, we can do that. But a lot of these things that are so crucial, that are so central to Torah philosophy, they were somehow left by the wayside along the way. The question is why? If you have such dedicated, committed individuals who are always learning and always keeping the mitzvahs and teaching their children, how did these things get lost? And the answer is very simple. Because they're not tangible. Anything that you can't grab onto, anything that isn't concrete, it's very hard to keep that going and to keep the focus. Because even if it's more important than other things, it's harder to stay with and transmit those feelings and those emotions from generation to generation. And therefore the actions are always there. Anything that's associated with doing something is a lot easier to maintain. I'll give you an example. Every Jew, not every Jew sadly, but a lot of Jews, although they might be very, very disconnected with Judaism, when it comes to the Passover Seder, that's something we do, or at least we know about, we get together. You ask that same person who goes to the Passover Seder, she makes the flight from Michigan to California to visit the family every year, and you ask her, that's wonderful, you're familiar with Passover. What Shavuos? She'll look at you, I have no idea. What is Shavuos? My sister-in-law's mother had a saying from her mother. When she would be referring to a time far off in the future, she would say, it's a year past Shavuos. She had no idea when Shavuos was, so it's a year after that. What's the difference between Passover and Shavuos?
A lot.
A lot. It's a lot of action. Passover, we have the Seder, we eat the matzah, we eat the mar, we have the charosis, we don't eat chametz, we have all these things, the 4 cups of wine, we have the Haggadah, the 4 questions. These are things that they live on and on, generation to generation, because we're doing things. We're engaged in a maisa, in an action.
I remember the Passover story.
That's why, when it comes to the things that are less tangible, when it comes to passing on certain feelings, certain emotions, certain perspectives or philosophies, it's a lot more difficult to maintain. Rabbi Dov Katz, a historian and a very knowledgeable person, he has a 5-volume series, and he writes, in his perspective, his opinion, the reason why there's been such a mass assimilation in the last couple hundred years isn't because America opened their doors to us, and it's not because of the Enlightenment, it's not because of anything else. It's because throughout the centuries, we weren't able to pass on the inner Torah, so to speak, and therefore what was left many times was more of the outer Torah, the shell, the skeleton. And when a child has that, and they don't feel the love, they don't sense the deeper meaning, if you have something else that comes up that looks more attractive, okay, it's been a pleasure, but I just met Christina. What do you want from me? So that's been the historical background of the last couple hundred years. And how do we maintain this inner Torah? How do we pass it on is very difficult. One of the things that's been lost along the way, and when I say lost, I don't mean, God forbid, totally lost. I mean from amongst the masses. We always have the shining lights of every generation, and there's always that solid core group of people that maintain authentic Torah philosophy. But by and large, when I refer to being lost, I mean many of the lay people. One of the things that have been lost along the way is meditation. And meditation, something that during the beginning of this period, the period where there was more assimilation, in the 18th century, there was a man by the name of Rabbi Yisrael, later known as the Baal Shem Tov. And he came onto the scene and he realized what was happening. He also realized that besides the lack of joy, the lack of that inner fire of Torah, there was a feeling amongst the lay people that if I can't be a scholar, if I don't have the mind capacity, if I don't have the leisure, and I can't sit and learn all day, then I'm worthless. So he felt that he had to do something, and he created the Hasidic movement. And in that movement, his goal was not to create something new. His goal was to try to reignite the fire that's always been there, to try to bring back that passion and that excitement of Judaism. He was very successful. Within 50 years from the beginning of the Hasidic movement, there were millions of Jews who associated with the Hasidic movement. About a century later, in the 19th century, another man by the name of Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, came into the picture, and he also felt there was something lacking, we had to do something, and he had a very different approach. And we're not going to have time to delve into the difference in their approach between Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and the Baal Shem Tov. They did very different things with the same goal, and that goal was to bring back some of this inner Torah that they felt that was lost along the way. Meditation is one of those things that we're going to see that they were trying to bring back in different forms and different methods. An introduction to meditation. When you think of Eastern philosophies, you think of Buddhism and Hinduism. So there are some interesting similarities between their form of meditation and our form of meditation. At the same time, there's some major differences. The Torah itself says, towards the end of Abraham's life, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But to the children of his other wives, Abraham gave gifts. Then he sent them away from Isaac his son, while he was alive, eastward to the east country. So he gives them gifts and sends them away. To Isaac, though, he passes on the tradition. He gives him the torch of leadership for the Jewish people. His other children, he sends away with special gifts. Says the Zohar, what were these gifts? He gave these children the names of the forces of spiritual darkness and banished them to the land of the east. It seems from the Zohar that Abraham had in his possession a lot of spiritual power. And to Isaac, the one who was carrying on the tradition of Judaism, he gave him the bracha, the blessing. To his other children, he gave them almost a different force. Now, why did he have this force in the first place, the dark side, if you'll refer to it as that? And why was it needed to be in the world? These are questions that are beyond the scope of this lecture, and perhaps beyond the scope of this speaker. But they had to be here in the world, and Abraham felt, I should give them to these children, and they should take them to the east. And it's based on that experience of history that a lot of the Eastern philosophies, you will find interesting similarities to Judaism, but at the same time, it's coming from a different side, the dark side on some level. So we have to be careful, although they're similar, there are going to be major distinctions. To understand the distinction, perhaps the most clear distinction, is based on the following question. If someone was to ask you, are you and your mind the same thing? So if you...
Mind or body?
No, not body. We know we're not our bodies. That we've already established. The body is the shoe, the body is the clothing.
Okay.
But am I the same thing as my mind? From the materialistic perspective, materialism, you should know, it's now used just to mean that someone is into the nice things and they like nice cars and nice homes, but it originated from a real philosophical standpoint. Materialism was the philosophy that there's nothing above or beyond the material. Anything that exists only exists here in the physical realm within time and space. That means that there's no such thing as a supernatural creator outside of time and space. That means there's no such thing as a soul, because all of these supposed forces don't exist within our reality. So if you're coming from the materialistic point of view, you would say, of course, I am my mind. What am I? I'm what I think I am. I think, therefore I am. All the thoughts that go through my mind, my identity, my memories, my choices. If God forbid somebody was brain dead, they wouldn't be themselves. So of course you are your mind. That's not the Torah perspective, nor is that the perspective of Eastern philosophy as well. We agree with Eastern philosophy in regards to the fact that I am not my mind. My mind is a tool that I have. And this is a very important distinction, because so often we get caught up in our thoughts, we get trapped in whatever we happen to be thinking about, and we assume that's me. And when that's me, I'm no longer in control of my thoughts, but I'm a victim to my thoughts. I'm not the pilot, I'm just a passenger. The Jewish perspective is, and the Eastern perspective as well, is the real I is something totally above and beyond the mind. And based on what we said a couple of classes ago, the idea of the shoe being symbolic of the body, and the body being symbolic of the body, and the soul being so much more than what the body is, towering above the shoe. So in a sense, the real me is towering above not just my body, but my mind. That being said, there is a very important distinction between Torah philosophy and Eastern philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, the goal of everything is to go above and beyond the mind, to totally forget about the mind, and just to be in the present. Have you read The Power of Now? Tole? Oh, but here's another one, The New Earth. Very good writer, and a lot of the things he says definitely on par with classic Jewish philosophy, but a lot of what he says is very far from Jewish philosophy. And it's that point. It's the point of the Eastern perspective is we want to let go of the mind because that's keeping us down. Once we realize that I am much more than that, then I can just be and be totally aware in the present. The Jewish perspective is, it's true that I am not my mind, but the mind is the most crucial tool that I have. All of my spiritual elevation, all of my spiritual accomplishment is only through utilizing the mind to its utmost capacity. In Eastern philosophy, the mind is an organism. It's viewed as anything else, any other muscle of the body. Why do you have an arm? When you need to lift something up, you use your arm. When you have to figure out a math equation, you use your mind. But in general, just stay far away from it. The Torah's philosophy is no. Utilize it, maximize it as much as possible, because it's through the mind, it's through the depth of the intellect, that's how we achieve higher levels of spirituality. When the Torah says, this is in the first paragraph of the Shema, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, V'haftas Hashem Elokecha, we have the obligation to feel a love for the Creator of the universe. And the Torah says, B'chol levavcha, we should feel that love with all of our heart, B'chol nafshecha, B'chol me'odecha, with all of your soul and all of your possessions. B'chol nafshecha, all of your soul is somewhat vague. And the Sforno, one of the great commentators of the 1500s, he explains that means with all of your intellectual capacity. The way to achieve love of the Creator of the universe is through the mind. One example of that is what Maimonides writes. Maimonides seems to be in contradiction with himself. In one place he says, how do you achieve love of God? It's the hardest thing in the world to do. How do you ever love a fellow human being? You get to know them, you go out for coffee, you schmooze, and eventually you get to love each other. How in the world do you come to love the Creator of the universe? I can't take God out for coffee. So in one place he writes, the way to do it is by using the intellect and examining the world around you, which means understanding the depth of wisdom that's in the creation, the intricacy, the sophistication in the human being, in the human mind, all the billions of neurons that are constantly connecting every split second, that are allowing me to stand here and speak and express myself, the reproductive system, all of that takes knowledge. All of the great Jewish rabbis, many of them were doctors and astronomers, and that was based on the fact that Torah philosophy is, use your head as much as possible. And by seeing that depth of wisdom, that will engender within me a love for the Creator. Elsewhere, however, Maimonides writes, the way to create a love for God is through delving into the learning of Torah. The deeper you get, the more into Torah you become, that itself will create feelings of love and a desire to connect. They're both true. It's not a contradiction. It's the same avenue of using the mind to see the depth of God's creation, either through the creation itself, through analyzing a flower or a human being, or through the Torah, another creation of God, delving in and seeing the wisdom through the Torah. But either way, we see the common thread, which is intellectual capacity maximized leads to high spiritual accomplishments. So that's one major difference between the Eastern approach and the Jewish approach. That's all background. Now let's get into some different forms of meditation. The first type I'd like to discuss is something that's referred to as mind control. And this is really based on the fact that I am separate from my mind. The goal of this exercise is to achieve awareness of that distinction, to be able to actually see myself as distinct and separate from my mind. Once again, I am the pilot, I'm in charge, and my mind is under my control, not vice versa. The goal of this mind control is, number one, so often we have a negative thought pattern. And we all have negative thoughts about ourselves, about others, about general life situations. And some of these patterns have been there since we're 3 years old. Because once we get in a certain way of thinking, it doesn't really change. Because we never learn how to think differently. You think of our education, and many of us are very educated. But what does that mean to be educated? What did they teach you in school, in high school, in college, in graduate school, and you got your PhD? What were they teaching you?
How to do it, not to do it. How to do it.
How to do it, the information you need to do whatever you're trying to specialize in.
Right.
Never, though.
You never learn, but you don't learn until you do it.
So that's true. You don't really learn until you're on the job and having to do it yourself.
Right.
But I think in regards to the educational piece of it, they're never teaching you how to think differently. Even in law school, for example, they're teaching you how to think logically, which is a good thing to know how to do. But even with that approach, you're not being able to get into my head and transform my perspective or change my thought patterns. That's something we never had exposure to. And the only real way to do that is doing it yourself. Going to school is not going to change the way you think, and the way you think many times is based on the fact that when you were 3, 4, and 5 years old, your parents treated you in a certain way. And this is not to blame parents for the way we think or the way we function, or the way we leave our cell phones on by mistake and forget to turn off the ringer. That was very rude of me, I apologize. The only way to change those thought patterns is by getting into your own mind as the pilot and looking at the mind as something separate and saying, you know what? This is not healthy. I'm no longer stuck in the pattern. I'm not on the roller coaster. I'm not the one who's screaming, get me off of the ride. But now I'm rising above it and I'm looking at it and I'm saying objectively, this is not a healthy way of viewing myself. This is not a healthy way of viewing life. That's one thing we achieve through mind control. Being able to see ourselves as something separate than the mind, and therefore being able to tweak things and change things in a more positive direction.
Change your thoughts.
Exactly. B of this is, another goal of mind control, is even if I'm not a negative person, and I'm not having thoughts very often that are detrimental to my overall well-being, but my mind's not organized. It's cluttered. And I might not mind that, but to be able to get in there and organize things and have everything in its proper file is something that can really change my whole life. If you ever have a room in your house, many times you'll have the living room and the dining room and the kitchen, they're looking fine, but the bedroom no one's allowed to go into, because that's the room where all the papers and all the bills, and that's just a mess. And if you ever have the opportunity, which I hope to someday myself, to get inside there and clean things up, you feel like a different person. The Orchos Tzaddikim, one of the great authors of the 1400s, he says when a person lives a life where you're able to be organized, it changes everything. My whole outlook on everyday life is just very different. So to be able to get into your mind and organize things is that much more powerful. C of this is, we know that in general we only use about 10% of our brain capacity. Is that true? Is it not true? I don't know. But I think through experience we've all seen we're not necessarily as focused as we could be, and many times when we're speaking to someone we get the feeling they could be more on the ball. There's more potential here to be tapped into. So in mind control it does, at least it gives us the opportunity to be able to work on focusing, to work on using as much of that potential that we have and accomplish a lot more and feel a lot more satisfied. There was a great yeshiva in Kelm. The Alter of Kelm was known for specializing in this form of mind control, where he would train his disciples constantly to be organized, to think not only in a logical way, but to help them transform their thought patterns to positive, productive ones. They had in the yeshiva as part of the daily schedule that they would have a 5-minute session where they would sit there by themselves at their desk and focus on one thought for 5 minutes straight. Just think about one idea and don't let your mind wander. I dare you to try that. Try that for 5 seconds. Wow. It's not easy. But what the Alter of Kelm was trying to achieve is this idea of mind control. And the only way to get better is by doing it. You start off slowly and you grow more and more. Where does this idea come into regular Jewish life? You don't see like a classic picture of the Hasidic Jew with the payas and the long coat and the shtreimel. They're not sitting there meditating, usually. Where this comes into play is in learning Torah. When you learn Torah and you try to get in depth, you try to ask real poignant questions, what you do is after a while, and it takes a while, because to get to a certain level of depth, you can't just open the book and get there. But once you get to a certain plane of awareness, and there's a certain laser focus, this is the question at hand, what is the answer? And I can't say this because of this issue, and I can't say this because of that factor. How do I put everything together? When you're in that deep of a focus, that itself is a form of meditation which accomplishes this idea of mind control. You're training your mind to really be a thinker.
Well, that's what Einstein did to, prove his theory. He just sat and thought for 10 years.
Easier said than done.
Right.
I hear. Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the great Torah giants of the 20th century, he died in the 80s. So towards the end of his life, he wasn't able to have many different types of medication, and therefore when he was going into a surgery, they could use very superficial means of dulling the pain. So what he would do is that he would give himself a half an hour before the surgery was scheduled. He would have his Gemara open in front of him, and he would say, just wait till I give you the signal. He would get deep into a certain area of Torah, until the point where he was so enthralled, he was so in this world, in another dimension, that he would give this signal, go for it. And that was able to diminish the pain, because he wasn't there. He was in a different realm. That's mind control. Nowadays, with the numerous forms of sources of information that we have at our fingertips, you can literally go to Google and find out anything you ever wanted to know and a lot more. So on one hand, that's a beautiful blessing. There's a lot of information out there. On the other hand, the amount of real knowledge that people have, or real wisdom, is that much less. Because by having all that information so easily accessible, that means we're never really training ourselves in regards to mind control. Where's the discipline needed to get the answer? Where's that focus needed to go to the library, find the book, sit down, do the research? The part of the experience of learning, or the experience of focusing the mind, doesn't really exist in today's day and age. And therefore we have to be aware of the fact that it's a lot harder to achieve this level of clarity. That's one idea, one form of quasi-meditation. A second idea, a second form of meditation is referred to as uncovering the subconscious. The idea of the subconscious, of the unconscious, that was not invented by Freud. We've known about these things for thousands of years. And the scary reality of life is that so much of what we do on a daily basis, we have no idea why we're doing it. We think we do. I know why I'm doing this because of X, Y, and Z. Because, whatever, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a mitzvah. But the real motives that we have, very often we're just totally unaware of. That's the subconscious motivation. I'll give you an example of this from the Torah itself. In the Torah we have Jacob, who finds out about his son Joseph, who's actually alive, and he's overwhelmed with joy, and he decides to take the whole family to go down to Egypt and be reunited with his son after 22 years. So they start on their journey, and he has to stop. And the Midrash tells us that when he stopped, he had to ask himself the following question. He said, Jacob, why are you really going down to Egypt? Of course you want to see your son, but did you really think it through? Do you really think this is a good idea? Are you going there for the benefit of the entire family? Or are you just going to Egypt because you're hungry and you know there's good food over there? That was the question he had to ask himself. Because he was concerned that perhaps his subconscious motivation was, I'm going to Egypt because I'm hungry and I want a good burger. But it's not really the right thing to do. He concluded, however, no. I would love a good burger as well, but that's not my main motivation. I'm going because I really feel this is the right thing. So even someone on the level of Jacob, that prophet, the person who was so in tune with spirituality and therefore so in tune with himself, he had to stop and ask, why am I doing this? It's so hard to know what drives us in life. It's so hard to know our motivations. The only way to do that, and this is this second quasi-form of meditation, is by pressing buttons. Pressing buttons means you ask yourself the question, why? The way to uncover the subconscious, to awaken it and bring it to the conscious, is by poking around and testing yourself. Because many times, even if you're not sure consciously why you're doing something, if you'll start asking questions and something might just click, 1 second. Maybe it really is because I'm just hungry. Maybe I'm just doing this because I want to look good on stage. Maybe I'm just doing this because I know if I do that, I'll probably get more money than doing whatever the case may be. Now that also requires a certain level of quiet, and this is true across the board. Any form of these quasi-meditations we're going to see in the more intense meditations, any form of meditation, you have to have a certain level of tranquility. And many times people use breathing techniques as a way of calming themselves down. But the goal is to try to relax, tune everything out, and then in this case it would be ask yourself the questions why you might be doing something to uncover any potential subconscious motivation. A third idea in regards to meditation is a form of thought that we could use to enhance any experience in life. So often in life, like we mentioned in the first part of the series from Henry David Thoreau, you're just walking around in your sleep, not really delving into life, not really juicing it, and as he said it, not living deliberately, not sucking the marrow out of life. So how do you do that? The only way to truly experience anything and to enhance that experience is through focus. A good example is ever seen a wine taster, a connoisseur of wine. And you take that sip of red wine and you take it slowly, you let it go around your lips, swish it around your mouth. You feel every possible aspect of that glass of wine. And then as you swallow it, you feel it go down your throat. And only then can you really have an appreciation. Is this good? Is this great? Now, if you were to picture yourself as this wine connoisseur standing in the middle of a hard rock concert or a heavy metal concert, and people are playing in the background, there's a big mosh pit there, and people are jumping and screaming, and you had to take that same wine and taste it with that same concentration, it would be difficult. Why is that the case? All I need for tasting wine is my taste buds, and my taste buds are still here, and they're working just as well. Why does it matter to play heavy metal music in the background? Because the idea is that for any sense to really use its capacity, you have to quiet out the outside world. So if you're in that level of tranquil and serenity and you're able to really focus on something, that's one aspect of intensifying any experience, is by blocking out anything in the outside realm. The outside realm, not just the noise and the clutter of daily life, but even the outside things in our mind. And the more we work on the mind control, the more we're able to block out other thoughts or other worries I might have, and therefore have more of the focus on what I'm doing. So that's the category of avoiding noise. The flip side of the coin is intensifying the experience itself through really focusing, through really delving in. You could give a family member a hug, give your child a hug and a kiss, and it's nice and lasts for a second, but if you don't really focus on it, it's nothing in comparison to what it could be. If you really had that intensity, you really had that passion of, I'm connecting with my child, I'm giving him or her a hug, I'm giving my brother a hug, what an amazing connection there is, that's an entirely different experience. So number one is drowning out the noise, and number two is really focusing in and trying to tune in and intensify as much as possible. We do this on a daily basis before we eat food. What do we do before we eat or drink anything? We say a bracha. We say a blessing. The point of every bracha that we make is one of two reasons. It will be both. It's A and B. A is to intensify the experience. you're just, on the run, and you grab something quickly and you're munching on it as you're running to catch the train, you're not really eating that. You're just doing something quickly to fill yourself up. And it's interesting, once you get habituated to saying brachos before you eat or drink, you'll look at someone else who doesn't say a bracha, and not even in a judgmental way. You'll just be surprised. How can you do that? Did you just take the thing and eat it? When do you stop it and really appreciate what you're doing? And that's an entirely different eating. You enjoy that apple so much more when you take literally 30 seconds and say, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, borei pri ha'etz. That's it. I'm acknowledging the fact that I'm here, I'm created for a purpose. There's a loving creator of the universe who made apples in order for me to enjoy them. That's a very different apple. So number one is intensifying the pleasure, and then number two is feeling that gratitude. There's no way to feel true happiness in life without being grateful. Right? The first step to feeling true joy is to feel appreciation. Without that, I'll never be satisfied. So being able to say a bracha is really a form of meditation where we're enhancing the experience itself. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was once in a cafe in Western Europe. He stopped by, got a cup of coffee, and he was sitting there, and the waiter gave him his bill. And it's for a lot more money than he expected. So he said, he was curious, why is it so much money? It was a good cup of coffee, but why so much? So he said, you have to understand, Rabbi, you're not just paying for the cup of coffee. You're paying for the ambiance. You're paying for the atmosphere, piano player, and we have wonderful curtains, and you have a nice view of the river. You're paying for everything. So he writes, when he walked out of that cafe, he had a new, more profound appreciation for what it means to say a bracha. He says, when I say a bracha, I'm not just saying a bracha on the apple, but I'm saying a bracha on the apple in the setting where I look around and I see the sky and the trees and I hear the birds chirping and I'm alive and well to be able to experience this. That's what a bracha is. You think of taking a glass of water. Here we have a glass of water, a styrofoam cup. I said a bracha before, by the way. So, it's not much.
Before the lecture?
It's not much, but you think about it for a split second. Where did that water come from? Well, ultimately, the way the world works is that we have the majority of Earth made from water, and that's the ocean. And based on an amazing process that the water evaporates, and it evaporates in a way where all the junk and all the salt that I can't digest stays within the ocean, and just the pure water vapor goes up into the sky, and those form clouds, and the sun's not too close to dissolve everything up right away, and it's not too far away to not enable the whole process. And you have the clouds, and through the force of wind, they carry these clouds across all the landmass, and then through you have precipitation, and the rain comes down, and it's that rain that ends up in my cup. So when I'm saying a bracha on a glass of water, I'm saying a bracha on a lot more than just the water. I'm expressing my appreciation for the entire world and how God made it, all for our pleasure. And that's something as well that if you focus on that, that can be a tremendous source of enhancing the experience, a form of meditation. We've discussed right now 3 different types of meditation. These are quasi-meditation I'm referring to, because they're not anything outside of our daily routine. They're pretty much doing everything the same way we are, just with a slightly different focus here and there. We have mind control, we have uncovering the subconscious, and we have enhancing the experience. 4 and 5, these last 2 methods, is where we get a little bit more creative. And this is where we differ from your average secular person. 4 is a form of meditation which enables you to take an intellectual idea and make it emotional. This is one of the biggest obstacles in life that we have. We can know something, and we can know it well, but when it comes to the way I behave, when it comes to what I actually do, that knowledge somehow doesn't register. It's the famous line that many people say, the longest distance in the world is the distance from my head to my heart. To make that transition is so difficult. How do you do that? And our whole lives we're constantly upset at ourselves. I knew better. I shouldn't have said that. I always make the same mistake. So how do we actually improve? Only way to do that is by somehow taking that knowledge and making it more emotional. How in the world do you do that? So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, in the 19th century, he had a brilliant idea. And he basically said, the only way of taking the intellect and making it more part of who we are is by getting emotional about the intellectual. So he says, therefore, if you know something, you know every time I speak to my sister on the phone, within 30 seconds we're yelling at each other. And you know the trigger. She mentions the car, she won't let go of that experience when you borrowed her car 6 months ago and you drove recklessly. And somehow she always mentions that, and then you get angry and defensive, and you say your line back, and then she says her line back, and this happens every time we speak. So you know that going into it. And your mind is telling you, just ignore it, don't get upset, change the topic. But then when you're on the phone, as soon as she mentions the car, you're right back to where you were last week. You can't help yourself. So explains Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, take time when you're not on the phone with her. And you're sitting down by yourself in a room, outside, whatever brings you the ultimate peace, and think about that experience in your head. Use imagery, use your imagination. He says the imagination isn't just there for children. It's one of the saddest things of our culture that you'll have children who have the best imaginations in the world. And I see my daughter, for example, she's 3 years old, and she could be literally playing with her babies for an hour and a half. Not always, a lot less than I would like her to. But sometimes she could really get into a zone, and she could be the mommy and the sister and the brother. She could be 4 different people in the family, and just having a great time. What happens as we get older? Why do we lose that power of imagination? Because we think there's no need for it anymore. I know the real world. I know what life's really about. Explains Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, you're wrong. Imagination was given to a human being to be utilized at 3, at 30, at 60, at 90. How do we as adults utilize the imagination? In this exact case, when I know I want to be doing something a little bit differently, then I take time alone in a peaceful setting, and I imagine that situation, and I picture myself responding in a way that I would like to. He says, besides using the imagination of picturing yourself being successful, you have to use music. Music, not necessarily blasting a stereo in the background, but your own voice, speaking to yourself. If you have a line that's inspirational that might help you, it might be a line from a poet, it might be a line from a Torah source. You say that line over and over again. It's almost like a mantra. And as you're saying that line, as you're saying words that are inspirational in some form of music, you're imagining that scenario, you're picturing yourself on the phone with that person, and what he's really saying is, make it as real as possible. Use every tool you have. Somebody once came up to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and made fun of him, and he said, is it true that your students sit in the basement sometimes holding a herring by the fire and saying, this is going to be our end? And he said, no, but if it would work, I would say go for it. Whatever works. So this is one idea which is hard to do, not super user-friendly, but I recommend, if you have one thing in life you feel is holding you back, take 5 minutes now and again, try it. Picture yourself going through that scenario where usually you fail, and see yourself succeeding. It could be the difference between not passing the challenge and overcoming it. The last part, and this is really between now me and other people. Meditation up until this point has been personal issues. Me trying to uplift myself, working on myself, and most people think of meditation as it's something I do by myself. In that sense, though, meditation could actually be selfish. Because all I'm doing is thinking about me. In Judaism, one of the most common forms of meditation we find is actually meditation in regards to thinking about other people. One idea is if you have someone at work, an acquaintance, a friend, and certain things just bother you. They're very arrogant. They say things that annoy you, whatever the case may be. And your natural reaction is, I'm very negative. And I only pick up on those issues that he has, and I don't see his qualities. It's very hard to see through. So there's a form of meditation where you actually think, you're sitting at your desk, before he comes and says good morning, you think about that person and try to focus on good qualities that he or she might have. And if you do that a couple of times, the next time you see them, you're going to be seeing somewhat of a different picture. That's hard as well. And it depends how annoying they are. If they're really annoying, it's very hard to see through that. There's a second form of interpersonal meditation, which is if something good happens to someone else that you know, to try to feel the way they feel. To feel happy, to feel excited just like they do. And at the same time, something bad happens to someone else, try to feel their pain on some level. Like we mentioned many times, feeling emotion is very hard for us to do here in 2013 in America. We can't do that. But the more we're able to, the more out of the self we're transcending, and the more similar to God we become. I remember many years back, there was a story with the two Israeli helicopters that crashed in midair, and I forget how many soldiers were killed, 30 or so. And when someone told the dean of my yeshiva, he was sitting there at the breakfast table with his wife, and someone went into the house and they said, Rabbi, we just heard the news that 2 helicopters crashed. On the spot, both him and his wife started crying hysterically about people they've never met in their lives. But there's such a connection, there's such an attunement. That's something we're very far from. But to be able to try as much as possible, when we have friends and family and they're experiencing either good or bad, to try to picture what they feel like. That itself is actually a fulfillment of the obligation of loving your fellow as yourself. The way you do that is not just by giving them things and saying good morning, but it's actually by trying to picture life the way they do. So that's a form of meditation in regards to the interpersonal realm. Lastly, we have the form of meditation between us and the Creator of the universe. What is this called in Hebrew, English, Japanese? Prayer. Prayer is something, like many other terms that have been very much perverted throughout the years in our Western civilization. Prayer is amongst those terms. It's dry, it's boring, it's awkward. No normal secular person wants to be involved with prayer. What is prayer in Hebrew? How do you say to pray? Lehitpalel. That's a reflexive verb, which means I'm doing something to myself. Why in the world is the term for prayer, the expression for the finite connecting with the infinite, why is that a reflexive verb? And the idea is clear, that somehow what I'm doing is not just communicating with the Creator of the universe, but I'm doing something to me. Lehitpalel. Because perhaps the greatest power prayer has is how it changes me. There's a fundamental philosophical issue with prayer, which many people are bothered by, which is, how can you pray? If you believe that everything happens for a reason, everything's part of the master plan, so if I pray that something should change, doesn't that mean I'm doubting the plan? Doesn't that mean I'm expressing a lack of faith? And the basic answer is no. It's actually the highest form of realization that the Creator of the universe is actually in control of everything. Because by me turning to the Creator and saying, please help, what I'm doing is I'm reinforcing in myself that things aren't just happening. It's not in his hands, not in her hands, it's not the illness, it's not the financial issue. Everything is in God's hands. So when I turn in prayer, I'm really strengthening within myself this belief, this awareness that the source of what will happen, of what could happen, how things could change, that source is the Creator of the universe. So it's not an expression of disbelief or lack of faith. It's actually the strongest way of creating more of an awareness that God does run the world. Somebody who I was speaking to last week, he said, I see people who are religious in prayer and going back and forth, and they seem to really be enjoying it. He said, I'm so jealous of them. I would love to be able to do that. And for years, I've attended the synagogue, and I try, and I look in the prayer book, but it's so hard to get into. How in the world do you do it, Rabbi? So I said, first of all, not every time I pray do I have that level of spiritual connection that you're referring to. That's the ideal, we try for that. But I said, it's a very different perspective. It's not about the Siddur, it's not about the prayer book. It's not about relating to something external than yourself. It's about connecting with God. And we do that in the most profound way. The way that we're instructed to do that is, and you read the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of Jewish law, it almost sounds like a Buddhist text. It says when you stand in prayer, you're supposed to remove your physical dimension. You're supposed to enter into the realm of the pure intellect and spiritual forces, and you should picture yourself standing there, just you and the Creator of the universe, and there's nothing else. And if you could do that, even for 30 seconds, having that level of awareness, I'm connecting with the Creator of the universe, that could change your whole day. And if you did that a couple times a week, that could change your life. But it's hard. And this is what takes focus. The first forms of meditation we mentioned, those are more easily accessible. You use mind control, you try to bring up the subconscious, you try to make the intellect more part of the emotion. When it comes to prayer, that's something that you have to actually take out time from your daily schedule and talk to God. And that many people feel awkward with. But if you do it, and you do it right, it can change your life. Somebody walks into a room and they see a fellow playing the guitar. And he's there, he's making beautiful music, and you can tell he's like in a different realm, a different world.